Pool is really proud to be a new member of MOBI, the MOBI Consortium. So I want to talk to you today for around 45 minutes then about Pool's vision for a mobility data union. And then hopefully we'll have enough time to answer your questions for the last 15 minutes or so, depending on how I manage to keep time. I know if Chris is here, then he might have some questions for me. But I prefer them from the rest of the audience because I know his will be perhaps pretty tough because he's seen this material before. So let me dive right in then and start with the opening problem, which is in a sort of typically British way is rather understated. The data economy is in flux. And, you know, I really could have stated that in various different ways. And if you know what's going on, you'll know that it's anything but just simply in flux. Tech monopolies teeter on the edge of public acceptance, and yet their information grab continues apace. Users are demanding ever more privacy as a way of asserting their control. Regulators are ready to hit back with anti-competitive measures and further rights to permit software users to port their data through open APIs, whether that's in California or in Europe. And if all of that wasn't enough, cookies are crumbling. Advertising DSP solutions about to undergo a huge extinction level event, unless they go and accept Google's flocks, which of course no one wants to do. Meanwhile, and I've been at this for a good number of years now, perhaps less than people in this room, but I'm sure you'll all agree with me, the vision of a smart city, right? Powered by data sharing, common infrastructure, and fully interoperable IoT devices seems just as far off as it's ever been. You know, there was a spurt of activity and interest, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago, as sort of, blockchain technology came along and everyone thought, okay, well, maybe this is the solution here, but, it really hasn't progressed at all. And vehicles, although computerized, even electrified, are not yet digitally native, right? They produce vast troves of information about their environment and their drivers, and yet that data remains largely siloed within the cars themselves. And if it goes beyond that, it's really not that much beyond. From an information perspective, therefore, vehicles really should be far more powerful and far more powerfully connected to the consumer than, say, a Fitbit, right? The average American spends about, an entire hour, in fact, a day behind the wheel of their car. Instead, the honest truth is that vehicles remain as analog as the wristwatches, Fitbits, are now replacing. And yet, if you believe in the Chris Dixon thesis, or the Andreessen Horowitz thesis, I should say, that software is eating the world, which I very much do, all of that is going to change, whether OEMs of vehicles and the people who therefore are custodians of that data economy promise for mobility, it'll all change, right? It'll all change, and it'll all happen whether you want it or not. So there are new solutions on the horizon. For us, the solution is really clear. For us at Pool, and for us now numbering tens of thousands of people, that solution is variously called data unions or data cooperatives or data trusts. They're supported, in fact, by new legislation coming out from the EU, and they all solve a very simple problem: how to incentivize users of software or hardware to genuinely consent to sharing the information they create, right? Instead of obscuring how data is collected in an application and then trying to turn that into an income stream for market actors other than the users themselves, data unions simply ask their members if they want to share their data, right? It's a really simple premise. Why don't you just ask people, right? Through a data union, therefore, data is no longer a byproduct. It is the product of our digital interactions, right? And this really does change almost everything in that regard. So through an application like a mobile app, a browser plugin, or a website, these data unions then draw their members' data into a pool of information which can be sold and monetized, et cetera, et cetera. And when those data sets are purchased or utilized by data buyers and third parties, both the data union operators, the duos as we call them, and their members get remunerated. Share and earn. It's really, in a sense, that simple. And this straightforward model allows data unions to align incentives around data creation, right? Data is the product. You want to create data. Well, great. Let's align those incentives around data creation. So data buyers and third parties can conveniently access rich seams of information. Operators have a thriving business model based on the sale of permissioned, explicitly and consensually shared data, right? Really important. If you're a data buyer right now, you're probably getting pushed by your board. As you know, I've had various conversations with huge enterprises at the moment, and they're all getting pushed by their board. So it's coming from the top level down about data governance, because no one wants to get caught in a data ethics scandal. Because if you do, you usually have to repent for many years later. Sometimes even businesses just close themselves down overnight. Data union members also then simply have to share and earn. They are also rewarded by the huge ecosystem benefits of unlocking their data into a managed, privacy-preserving way so that new services can be provided back to them. So these data unions are cracking problems all over the place and actually doing, I think, a pretty good job. They're growing in terms of user adoption, coalition building, and investment. They represent actually this novel form of Web3 adoption where market possibilities are clearly visible. And the model is backed, as I said, not just by EU regulators, but also by thinkers and activists and technologists like Andrew Yang, Jaron Lanier, Glenn Weil, and actually one of the most academically cited computer scientists in the world, Professor Sandy Pentland of MIT. Web and mobile DUs like GeoDB, Panel App, Kili, Swash, Tap My Data, and Mobile X Expression already have millions of users between them, and they're earning income from filling in surveys or permitting their browsing or location data to be read and monetized in a privacy-preserving and privacy-protecting manner. So to date, these DUs, or passive income apps, sometimes they're also known, have had plenty of successes in getting off the ground with the support of investment, both traditional finance and it's also known as crowd-based finance. So Placed, to give one example, raised, I think, about 13.4 million in 2011 for its Panel app, and they were recently bought by Foursquare in a, I think, sort of, no one ever gives you the numbers, but a $150 million deal it was mooted to be. In 2020, GeoDB raised 3.4 million in the UK, and Swash, one of the data unions I've been sort of closest to and helping to incubate, actually just raised 19 million a few weeks ago. So they've been incredibly successful in getting off the ground, starting to scale, and bringing in investment. And I mean, maybe we can talk in questions about kind of what they all do, but Swash, for example, has a browser plugin and is an analytic solution, rather a bit like Ozone. Cake works and utilizes open banking infrastructure in the EU to allow users to port their financial data from their bank straight into a data union. So fantastic. Geocache, simple mobile app, and it uses and utilizes geolocation data from users, again, to create a monetizable data product on that, say. And Big Token is largely based around asking consumers survey questions. So a whole panoply of data unions just there. And of course, Mozilla did a survey in 2020, so last year. And that really shows, this slide really shows the variance in that sort of nascent market. There's lots of DUs in lots of different verticals, and many are for profit. I think about 40 out of the 110 they realized were for profit apps. Not all are like that, some is about social sharing as well. So finally, in fact, to say on this point, data unions have organized themselves into highly effective lobbying and information sharing and standard setting ecosystems under the My Data Global banner. That comprises nearly about 30 projects as builders of these new user-focused data organizations and about 100 associate member bodies as well. And all of this has occurred in the last 2.5 years, which is really fascinating growth. They're, as I mentioned, supported by new EU legislation. The specific legislation is the Data Governance Act. And it's because people are starting now to take bets on what will succeed. And the EU is starting also to take a bet on what will succeed the current data economy. So in late 2020, they seized upon the idea of data unions, and they called them data cooperatives in the legislation, to encourage just that, right? That model of share and earn. And they've also made their intentions clear because they want data unions to succeed and allotting 2 billion in grants to help that vision come to fruition. So you're probably also wondering at this point, well, what does Pool do in all of this, right? Well, we're taking a huge bet too, that the future of data will be unlocked through these data unions. Pool provides a platform and associated services to support those data unions to develop, scale, and monetize. We're basically layer zero for data unions. Specifically, the platform that we're building will enable duos to data union operators to facilitate payments to members, scale membership, market their data streams to enterprise buyers, and generate new revenue streams through our platform services. I'll come to our product stack exactly, but ostensibly, as I said, we are layer zero for data unions. So our framework makes it not easy only to unlock that sort of vast, actually, let me just go back to the last slide. So here's specifically what we offer in terms of the stack: a messaging network, payments, right? Messaging networks are perhaps not that interesting in many senses, but all data unions need that backend messaging infrastructure. The payments is perhaps more interesting, right? Because it's that solution has only really been unlocked in the last year and a half. Blockchain is always promised, in essence, cheaper financial transaction costs. But as anyone who's ever used Ethereum will know, those transaction costs are now far, far higher than traditional banking. So you need to look to layer 1 or layer 2 solutions, however you deem them, to really get micropayment services. And that now exists with the likes of XDAI and with Polygon, which really do offer transaction costs at a tenth of a cent. So that has made, obviously, data unions viable, which need to distribute, say, a payment from one buyer to 1 million users or members. It's made that sort of solution very viable, but only very recently, which is why all these data unions are also starting to pop up. We also offer those on and off ramps, right? The infrastructure needs to be built. If you want this thing to work, it needs to be built in Web3, but of course, all the data buyers are in Web2. So Pool acts as a bridge between Web2 data buyers and Web3 tech stacks. We also provide static and real-time data. We've just been doing a lot of market research of late, talking to data buyers from all sorts of verticals all over the place to ask about what their needs are now and in the future. It turns out governance is actually one of the hugest, one of the most growing problems that they're facing. So they're looking for ethical data solutions to fill in their needs in terms of information. And finally, we also provide a marketplace with this very interesting aspect, which is when you start to bring together a vertical of data unions and a number of these operators, you can start to leverage that value in a way that you couldn't do if these were operating separately, which is to, for example, run an analytics solution over the top of all of these data union operators, right? So you might have, like, for example, with Cake, I showed you, there's another version of that called Unbanks. You might have financial transaction data, you might have web analytics data, you might have fitness data coming from, say, Fitbit. In a data union, great, you can start to query all of that. Let's say you're a sporting vendor in Southeast Asia, interested in travel, and that's your business focus. Great, well, now you need to know people who have Googled about Southeast Asia and going on trips, but also are avid marathon runners and also have enough money in their bank, ostensibly, an income to be able to pay for that luxury sporting holiday that you're putting together. Great. The analytics solution on our marketplace would allow you to do that, which isn't, you can't really get that kind of information anywhere else. So Pool's data union framework not only makes it easy to unlock that vast value in personal information, it also solidifies explicit data consent under current privacy regulation and as I said, forthcoming data EU governance regulation. And it creates those sustainable relationships between data creators, analytics businesses, and the multitude of companies seeking to buy raw, refined, extrapolated, and synthetic data. We also leverage the value of that ecosystem for the members themselves, right? Here you can see a mock-up of our what we're calling wallet. So if you've joined one data union from the member side, well, why wouldn't you join 2 or 3 or 4, right? You're sold on the proposition already. Why wouldn't you join another one? So we've got a wallet with a discovery engine. You need a place to obviously manage all of that income coming from all those data unions. But more than that, once you've created a well-governed, well-structured, easily monetizable stream of information from joining one data union, well, at zero marginal cost, copy that into a personal data vault. That's nice. But now you're joining 2 or 3 of these things. So now you're getting a rich stream of information coming through. Where do you store that? You store that in a personal data vault, which is part of the wallet, right? And this provides solutions now for advertisers. Why? Because this PDV, this personal data vault, is attached to your wallet, becomes your digital expression. It becomes the cookie, right? So this is what becomes the cookie of the future. And you can start to now imagine, well, what if you had a mobility data union, right? And all of that information was also stored by the individual, unlocked by the individual, controlled by the individual, but monetized by the data union, in essence. When you turn up at an advertising solution at a website, the DSP will ask to read your PDV and will pay you to unlock that, right? And then serve you the, for example, the correct ad, or the ad that's entirely optimized for the data that you've been generating over the years, right? So we've got a world-class design team and ruthless product focus. And you'll see that development emanate in Q2, Q3 next year. Let me just explain the last then bit about Pool. This is a kind of overall architectural vision of how it works. The data represents the blue lines coming out from the data union members and ending up in the marketplace on the right-hand side where the buyers purchase. The red lines represent the flow of money, and that gets converted into US dollar stable coins. So it can be passed back to the members, the data unit operators, and of course, Pool itself. Our business model is really simple. We just take 5% of all the transactions that happen on our marketplace, and a further 2% then goes to buying and burning our own token, which is a common now model in Web3. It's how we return value back to our ecosystem. So let's get to the bit where I think everyone here wants to talk about, which is what about a mobility data union, right? And what about mobility data? So where does mobility data just sit in all of this, right? With all this flux in the data economy, how are vehicle OEMs moving forward into this digital future? After the mobile phone and the laptop or desktop, vehicles are actually likely really to be the third most powerful data generating piece of ubiquitous hardware. From that perspective, the future seems incredibly promising, doesn't it? So, I began these conversations about 3 years ago, talking with Moby, with Chris, with companies like Bosch, Fetch AI, and others. And I think at that time, it was clear that the timing wasn't right. Back then, I think the big idea seemed to be, and this is from somewhat the outsider perspective in a sense, that car companies would themselves strike out individually and try to dominate this world of mobility data themselves, right? We'll be the Facebook of cars was the line that I kept hearing from individual OEMs. I think that opportunity threat matrix has changed rapidly during that time, right? Car owners are far more privacy sensitive than ever before. And from the manufacturer's perspective, the realization has dawned, from what I'm hearing, that Google or Apple are far more likely to conquer this space as any hardware making car manufacturer could, right? It's deeply worrying, should be deeply worrying for people who, as I said, have created what could be the third most ubiquitous piece of hardware for collecting information about people's environment. And yet, right? That's the big question mark. And question marks kind of also answered in this way, which is, well, okay, fine. How much is the car data market worth? I don't think anyone has any decent figures, really. You can go, I'm sure McKinsey has a few and et cetera. But, the opportunity is clearly there, right? There's little point, in my view, trying to affix a number to the total worth of the car data market. Why? Because if just every vehicle in Europe and US could share their data into a singular stream of information, that in itself would generate value in the hundreds of billions, right? the hundreds of billions over time. And in addition, so we all know that the prize is big. And in addition, the potential to advertise to vehicle owners by utilizing that trove of data and value likely doubles again, right? Doubles again. Vehicles would become truly digital objects, right? Passing value right along the current product life cycle from OEMs to owners to manufacturers of goods, and then out again to city authorities, insurers, mechanics, AI, ML companies, logistics companies. The list goes on and on and on. So why is it so hard, or why has it been so hard to get data out of cars? People in this room here and those listening will know perhaps how hard it is themselves, but these are the lessons at least I've garnered. What's fundamentally plagued vehicles from becoming digitally native objects are the following largely, I think, technical problems. It's not just technical, but largely technical. Obtaining data from a car's CAN bus and connecting it to real-time data to the rest, connecting it in real time to the rest of the digital world is really difficult, right? Structuring that data in a common format through common protocols is really difficult. Obtaining consent from vehicle owners to use and share that data is also, again, really difficult. Creating monetizable data products from multi-party systems is also a huge issue, And then finally, if you get this far, you still got to create advertising solutions that utilize vehicle data and plug into existing ad tech. All of that is really, really difficult. And I know because you've been involved in my own projects, involved with Bosch and a former company that I was with, it is really, really hard to get entire industries to move forward on this. I think there's a solution. The solution to the above set of problems is actually, in the end, fairly simple, right? There's a lot of what seems to be technical issues, but actually they are solvable, right? You just need the right structure, right, to really crack all of this. For me, the answer is actually fairly simple. Set up a mobility data union, right? The car industry for decades have been telling drivers that when they sit in front of their steering wheel, right, they're in control. They own the road, they are the master of their destiny. Car companies cannot simply say to their drivers, right, that well done, you own your car, but not your data. You own your car, but not your data, right? You can't say that, most especially in this climate, right? So a mobility data union gets around that problem, right? Permission the data from your car and work with potentially the car companies themselves, right? Who could also be the operator of that mobility data union, to monetize the data and prosper from all those associated services together, right? It's a cooperative partnership, right? Between the data union operator, potentially the car manufacturer themselves, and the people who own those cars, whether they be, it's a fleet ownership or individual ownership, et cetera, et cetera. And actually a simple app would aid car owners through the otherwise seemingly complex privacy and preference processes, right? You'd be putting them in control of their data in a few simple steps and opening out an economy to them worth billions, tens of billions. But yeah, right? That was version 1 solution. I think because there's a problem there, right? There's a problem. And it's at the other end of the spectrum. Who would buy this data, right? Is data from just, let's say, Ford vehicles or Honda vehicles or Nissan vehicles, even though numbering in the tens of millions, really leveraging value, really creating data products that the data buyers themselves want? The answer to that is no, not really. And the reason is because I spoke to them over many years, and that's not really what they want, right? They don't care what the car is. They care about the person in the car, right? So let's just take a step back for a second and scope out perhaps who the stakeholders could be for any given mobility data union. Maybe that gives us an insight then into how to structure this, right? Because it feels right, it feels like it could be a data union solution, but it's not quite right. So what's going wrong? So here's not a very exhaustive list, but it captures, I think, the main players in all of this, right? The main stakeholders. First bit is the vehicle owners, right? The companies or individuals, right? Then you've got the vehicle manufacturers. Great. You've got the data product owners, and they could be made up of data scientists, data product specialists, marketers, et cetera, right? People who understand what it is that's being created from cars, from vehicles moving around into the world under the control of a human being, and how to turn that into marketable, monetizable insights in all sorts of ways, right? Then you've got the software and hardware infrastructure providers, right? So it's all the associated services, but also, you know, the people who actually build the hardware that'll help get the data out of the car, right? Some of them are part of the MOBI consortium as it is. I think I worked previously with Riddle and Code, and they were excellent at creating some of that hardware to work in and operate inside the car and create those ID solutions that go with that as well. And then finally, there's the advertisers and the other data buyers, right? So those are the main. Let's just recap that. The vehicle owners, the vehicle manufacturers, the data product owners, software and hardware infrastructure providers, and finally the advertisers and other data buyers, right? So those are the list of 5 main stakeholders. So looking at this list, maybe we need to refine this solution here, right? We need users to permission their data and be part of a reward scheme. That's great. We need manufacturers to be incentivized enough to permission the data to leave the car. We need people who manage data products coming out of the car to also have a material interest in this, right? They would, of course, be directly employed by, they could be directly employed by the individual manufacturers, right? Those data product people, the data scientists, etc. But the last stakeholders on the list, the last 2, might not be fully satisfied. Why? Let me give you an example. The last 2 being the software and hardware infrastructure providers and the advertisers and other data buyers. So what's the example I want to give? I want to give the example of the book industry, right? It was once, about 40 years ago, really, really hard to find out what sales were like. This is in the UK, week by week, right? And it was nigh on impossible for publishers of books, if it was books that they weren't publishing, to figure out what was happening in bookstores. It was impossible for readers to find out what were the bestsellers, etc., etc. The whole ecosystem of books suffered because there wasn't a singular source of truth on what was going on across thousands of bookshops, right, independent and chains in the UK. And they all realized it would be good for the industry as a whole if they all knew this, right? They all knew that, except what do? They siloed their data, right? The publishers kind of knew what was going on because obviously they were selling the books to, you know, and then they get returns, so they do the accounting. So it was very slow. Obviously the independent retailers knew what was happening in their store, but they didn't want to give that away to their store down the road because that was their competitor, and so on and so forth. This story is very familiar. I'm sure you've all heard this in your own industry, right? And they cracked it, and they cracked it because they gave up the day. They realized that if they wanted to create better overall products, they wanted the book industry as a whole to grow, right? For everyone, therefore, to succeed, you know, rising tide, all boats, etc. They had to cooperate. They had to cooperate. They solved it by conceding, in that particular example, to giving it up to third parties like Nielsen, and actually the industry just picks one provider each year to do it, right? To do that. And to be the provider of choice in the data standard in that regard. So it's also often how these things are solved, right? And not just the books industry, but in other industries. And I'll give you another example shortly. So how do we create a more industry-wide data product for mobility when there are so many disparate providers, right, out there? So this is where I think the solution really evolves to. It's not just a mobility data union, it's a cooperative mobility data union, which sort of maybe sounds like a tautology, right? If you know what a cooperative is and a union. But what is this? What am I talking about? Well, a cooperative mobility data union would bring the benefit of having a singular focus, right? A team leading, being the data union operator, figuring out what the data, how to monetize that data, figuring out how to onboard members from any car, right? That's part of that cooperative. Whilst also realizing cooperation for mutual ends between parties that might otherwise be competitors, right? Different car manufacturers, for example. And this is what this data union is. It's a cooperative for data stakeholders, right? Where everyone can benefit, right? The structure would not have all the benefits, would not only have all the benefits of a data union, but would also allow it to create monetizable data products for multi-party systems, right? It doesn't matter where the data is coming from in terms of a car manufacturer. It doesn't matter which car it's coming from, right? You now have an incentive. They all have an incentive to say, okay, look, we're all owners of this data union, right? Whoever is part of the cooperative, we all benefit from it. Brilliant, great. So let's all create then, the second thing is structure data in a common format, right? Suddenly you now got the financial and monetary incentive to do that, because I know you've all been having conversations for many, many years about how to create common formats. And I know all the problems I've watched in many other verticals and industries about how to create common formats between. It's really, really difficult because someone comes along with a standard. No one else wants to abide by that standard because it's their standard, and everyone gets huffy about it. And that's basically what happens because humans are humans, right? Also, you can create industry-wide interoperable third-party solutions, right? Finally, now we're talking, right? All those third parties that want to come in and leverage value from the data that's been created from the cars, well, they can come in and it's easy for them because they don't have to think about 6 or 7 different standards for each car, right? Manufacturer, right? So you're creating industry-wide interoperable third-party solutions such as advertising, and that utilize vehicle data and plug into existing ad tech, right? And things that solutions that can plug into the already existing, very developed data economy. So I just want to recap that. What's the difference between, you can create a data union, and each car manufacturer could say, create its own data union for its own cars. That would be a mistake. The proposition here is to create a cooperative between car manufacturers, between OEMs, to come together and say, right, we'll all own a piece of the pie from an equity perspective. We're going to give over the duty to run this to a specific team. And that team will take that forward, right? And out of that, not only do you get the benefits of allowing users, drivers, members to say, yes, permission my data, and I'll be able to benefit from those products as they're monetized, but also you're creating monetizable data products from multi-party systems, structuring data in that common format. Finally, I think this might get unlocked. And finally, you're also creating industry-wide interoperable third-party solutions. So how would an actual co-op work, right? That's the plan, but how would you actually start to really bring it together? As I said, cooperatives bring the benefits of having a central team with that singular focus while realizing cooperation for mutual ends between parties that would otherwise be competitors. Great, brilliant. Mobility data union operators would bring together vehicle owners, whether they be companies or individuals, and also several vehicle manufacturers and the data product owners with an effective joint venture with a single leadership team, but many equity stakeholders. So single leadership team, many equity stakeholders. The data union operator would then work with the software and hardware infrastructure providers and advertisers and other data buyers to truly leverage that value. And this is a pattern that's been repeated, right? So has anyone else done this before? Yes. I think if you look into your wallet right now, your actual hard wallet, if you still carry those around, you probably find the most successful cooperative in the world sitting right there in your wallet. It's a Visa card, right? Visa is one of the most successful cooperatives in the world. What was it, right? How did it start? Same problem, right? Like, how do we create common standard formats for all banks? We've got lots of members, right? Or consumers. We've got multiple banks, and we just need a singular solution. Wouldn't it be great if, and what did they do? They said, well, why don't we just own one company and then we're all aligned? Wouldn't that make a lot more sense? And it has. It's now huge, right? It's a global brand worth tens and tens of billions, and you've all got it in your pocket in all likelihood. So been chatting with Chris about some of this and lots of other people about how you'd actually get down to the nuts and bolts of putting this together, because it's nice to talk, but it's much, much better to actually activate and do. How am I doing for time? Yeah, good. So put together a scoping document and 3 phases. It's pretty obvious. All this is, I think, fairly basic to anyone. The first phase would be scoping and feasibility. The second would be creating an MVP and a pilot stage. And the third phase would finally be establishing that joint venture and funding arrangements. So what would Pool do in all of this? Well, we'd effectively incubate this mobility data union from inception to MVP, and then beyond, ensuring, like we do with other data unions, the mobility data union, this cooperative mobility data union, could concentrate on its core challenges, right? So they don't have to worry about the back end. They don't have to worry about that marketplace. They don't actually have to worry about the relationship with data buyers, because we have lots of those, including with the world's largest advertiser, WPP. They could instead concentrate on scaling membership, creating innovative data products with buyers and advertisers, and obviously worrying about those technical challenges from the car perspective, right? From the vehicular perspective, I should say, to realize as much value as possible for their real-time information sets. So I think that probably now brings me to a close. I just want to say thank you. I hope, in a sense, that makes sense. I think it's a really exciting vision, and it's one that I've been mulling over with many of our advisors within Pool, but also more broadly with both in the mobility industry and in the sort of software, hardware, and obviously the advertising industry. Lots of people are excited by this. They want to see it happen because I think everyone knows the value that can be unlocked by this. The question is, you know, can we actually bring this together, right? Can the players come forward to say, let's create a cooperative? I think that's probably the one of the few solutions left, I think, to make this work and actually create a data economy from vehicles that is fit for the 21st century. Thank you so much. I'm here for questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, everyone, if you want to submit questions, just make sure you're sending them to the everyone selection in the chat box and we can answer them. So we have one question, it looks like about stakeholders. Our insurance companies, toll road administrators, looks like they're missing, or would these be data buyers?
In all likelihood, I mean, it's hard to, I said it wasn't an exhaustive list. There are always more stakeholders in anything like this. And God knows that, you know, the mobility world is deeply complicated, right? But yeah, I think they'd probably, in all likelihood, be data buyers, right? You know, there's always those challenges, you know, cars, someone like that, like a toll operator might just want to subscribe to the data for a very short period of time. How do you sort out those challenges? They don't want to be buying historical data sets, for example, right? But it's that allows them to become a kind of sharing, a quick sharing permissioned thing, and that depends on the messaging networks. But yeah, I think they probably fall into that bracket, if that answered that question.
Great. All right, another question. How is the data stored in the data union? How is it secured from hacks, etc.? That's the first question.
Yeah, so the data union, so Pool, we should say, doesn't store any data as such, right? It's the data union operators that themselves store this data. The vast proportion of the, almost all of this data then is, what you're doing is creating pseudonymized or anonymized streams of information, right? So that's the end product. So it doesn't actually identify any individuals. That's the intention. And that's the beauty of having an app, an application whose sole purpose is to just create data products, right? Almost no application out there that you utilize, if you look on your phone, they will do something else, and data is the byproduct of all of that. So you can do that when the data is the product, then you can create these applications that work in just that way, right? Far easier than ever before. The data from the user's perspective is held in a PDV, right? That PDV that I mentioned, that wallet app. And that's controlled, it's encrypted and then controlled. So we store it in the back end, in effect. Well, the user actually stores it, so it's custodial to them. And it'll be stored on IPFS, who I think is a member of Mobi, if I'm not mistaken. You've got so many members, it's hard to tell. And specifically a solution called Ceramic. So that's how that's done. So it's done ostensibly on the blockchain. It's unlocked by their private key. Or by giving permission to a third party to do that. And of course, that's also done in a zero knowledge way. So no third party are actually taking the data. And to be honest, no third parties just don't want data anymore, right? They want to know answers. That's not the same thing. No one wants to handle vast troves of personal information. It's just too much overhead from a regulatory point of view. So hopefully that answers that question. There's more to that question, right?
Yeah, so the second part, would OEMs likely have a data union for themselves and then a toned down version for industry data union? Second part, basically, would OEMs be concerned about the proprietary nature of their data being included in a broader data union? What's their incentive versus something like airlines, where for safety purposes and reputation of the entire industry is viewed more of a monolith, so the incentive for sharing is strong there?
Derek, great questions. They each obviously individually. I'll try and be brief with them. Okay, so would OEMs likely have a data union for themselves? Well, the purpose of a data union is that it itself represents its members and has actually in Europe the legislation will be that they're supposed to have a fiduciary duty to those members. Car companies can utilize this, or OEMs can utilize this themselves, sure, but they shouldn't really have any special favored access to any of this, would be my view. That might not be how it ends up, to their own data. They're going to see what happens, in essence, coming out of the car before it's probably scrubbed clear for personal information purposes. So yeah, you're going to have, basically, the short version is you're going to have different data products coming out, and the one that's retailed at the end is likely to be far more scrubbed, cleaned, or toned down, to use your vernacular, than the one that would be originally created from the cars themselves in the first instance. Would OEMs be concerned about the proprietary nature of the data being included in a broader data union? Yeah, that's a major problem, but it's also not a major problem. I always feel like it's sort of an excuse that, and maybe this is being far too harsh or far too technically ignorant, but it is very possible to get real-time data out of a car without giving away proprietary information. What happens is, I found, is that car manufacturers throw out their hands and go, oh no, that's going to be proprietary, we can't do that. And all of that's motivated, from what I've seen, and again, this might be too hubristic to sort of say, because no single manufacturer wants to take that first step, right? It's remarkable in opening out their data and allowing their users to actually port their data away from the car. Two things to say on that. Tesla, right, world's most progressive in that sense from a digital perspective car manufacturer out there. I'm sure people will disagree, but they're at least viewed as such. They don't have an official API for their cars. They have an unofficial one, but they could close that at any second, right? So even Tesla has not progressed on this basis, which is remarkable to me. The second thing is that OEMs are going to lose out anyway. It's not going to be very long before GDPR affects cars, because cars are just gadgets, aren't they, on wheels? And if you can take your users are going to want to port their data away from their Fitbit, and they want to have the right to do so. We're not very far away from the legislation's already there in draft in Europe. So users are just going to say, I can do this anyway. So if you don't get on board, they'll just do it anyway, right? They'll say, I demand the right to port it. And you're going to have to figure out those interoperable solutions. And you're going to have to do it in real time. No more of this GDPR from 2016 and the right to portability, where you have to send an email and you get it after 30 days. It's going to be, I deserve API access because I have a fundamental right to port my data from the thing that I own, right? Cars, gadgets of all kinds, all that hardware stuff, your fridge, your washing machine, your Fitbit, your Alexa, all of that stuff. We're not very far, 5 years away from it all being ported and portable by fundamental right by the owners of those gadgets. Do you want to move on to Ben's questions? So,
sure. Yeah, so can you describe more about where the current line or overlap is between streamer and pool, or on where work on data unions is being done?
Currently, yeah, yes. So it's a slightly awkward question because it came from streamer. So I spent 3 years working there, developing and being one of the co-creators of their data unions framework. There are some fundamental differences, and I think the main one is that, they've been focusing on, as per their white paper, by and large, not solely, but by and large, on their network developments. They come at it from a perspective of developing the back-end messaging infrastructure, right? We're very much focused on the data unions themselves, which for Streamer has been something they have concentrated on, but it's not their core purpose. So for us, at Pool, I think what we really want to align is this. We realize that the backend stack for data unions needs to be Web3, right? You're not going to be able to create data unions unless ultimately, and we've watched people create them in a Web 2 version, which means you have to create APIs with Stripe and all these other sort of payment providers and PayPal. It's a nightmare to run, and you can't give users anything until they get to $20, and you don't get the margins because the costs are too high. And the tech stack is impossible to run, right? It's really, really difficult. And it breaks at scale. Web3 allows you to do that. Great, brilliant. Where are the buyers? They're not in Web3. There are almost zero, in terms of relative scale, buyers in Web3 who like to pay with crypto. So you have to have a Web2 facing marketplace and a Web3 facing tech stack. And we're that bridge. Pool is that bridge in that route, which is why we've got partnerships, as I said, with the world's largest advertiser, and have regular conversations with other major enterprises in the world who are very interested in all of this and are comfortable with what we're building.
Great. So our next question says, as everything digital cannot be financialized, this is a no-brainer. As the data first and foremost resides with mobility users, isn't there a key education piece that shows consumers use cases as to how they can benefit from their data, building the demand for them to give permission with education and build that ground root demand?
I mean, why I'm delivering this talk to this forum is because you can educate consumers all they want, but they don't yet have that right and ability to port their data out of their car, which is insane. As I said, it is, why isn't the car as powerful a digital object as your phone or your laptop, right? It's crazy. And everyone I'm sure here will agree with that, and then wonder, well, why is that so? And have very various answers. I think I get excited about that world. I get really excited about that world, which is far more convenient when you start porting data out of your car, far more convenient than it is now, right? Paying road tolls, or getting much more beneficial insurance rates, or actually, I just want my mechanic to ring me up and tell me, oh, by the way, you've got a problem with your car, way before I know, right? Because I'm digitally twinned with my mechanic, right? Because that was easy to do. All I went is do to the mechanic, and I just gave him my QR code for the car, and we swapped, and that was it. Brilliant. That's the world I want to live in. And I think it's really easy to educate consumers, and it won't be about the money. The money will be nice, but it's, as we've done a lot of market research on this, it's actually about digital dignity, right? People want to be recognized. The money is symbolic of that. It's not the actual amounts of money that people want. It's the symbolic recognition that we value you, right? And so therefore it can't be air miles. It can't be like, Honda or Ford or Nissan points. It's got to actually be real interchangeable US dollar stablecoin. And that's what we provide for. But what they really will come for is the convenience, right? Is the services. Once we turn cars into actual digitally native objects, the world is everyone's oyster from every perspective.
Great. So I think we have time for probably one or two more questions. So our next one is from Chris. He says, you spoke about advertisers such as WPP using the data from a mobility data union. Are infrastructure owners and smart city operators perhaps even bigger consumers of mobility data?
Yes and no. Yes, they're definitely potentially bigger, but I know from my conversations with advertisers, they're desperate for information from cars from two reasons, right? One is from an analytics and perspective, right? They can understand who those people in the cars are, right? And in essence, what they do, how they behave, where they travel to, and therefore, what makes them tick, right? So all advertisers want, they want to know what makes human beings tick. Great. Serving the ads, the blunt proposition has always been, well, the ads will come back into the car, right? And that is a real thing, right? That can absolutely happen. It's actually far more valuable to take the data and go, okay, right, now we know how these kinds of people operate. Well, these kinds of people also show up here, here, and here, and we can serve them ads there, there, and there as well. The solution that we provide for is even more tailored than that. You actually take your car data from, if you're a driver, and you're part of a mobility data union, this cooperative mobility data union, and it's copied to your personal data vault. But it's also copied with all the other streams of data that you might join from your, your fitness data union or financial data union. When you show up at a website, let's just take that, it can read that and serve you wonderfully tailored ads that are totally optimized, therefore, for who you are. It also knows, therefore, what you do from a mobility perspective, right? What kind of driver you are, what kind of, and they can merge that with all sorts of other data sets. By the way, from a perspective of it being the cookies don't have anything on this solution, right? People have been talking about this solution for 15 years. And the reason why they haven't been built is because it's really hard to fill up a PDV with well-structured, well-governed data. Not anymore. We have the exact opposite problem. We've got all of these data unions with great, well-structured, well-governed data, but nowhere to put it, right? So yes, I think advertising presents a larger solution. Compared to smart city operators and infrastructure owners, well, the potential is there, but smart cities have yet to prove themselves in many other ways. This will help unlock that solution, but as everyone knows, that's a separate conversation, right? About all the issues that smart city operators have.
Great, thank you. So I think we're getting pretty close to time. Does anyone have any last minute questions? You can send those in the chat.
I think my colleague John, who's CTO at Pool, is also here. I know,
Hi guys.
John, you thanks for joining. I don't know if you wanted to add anything from quickly while we've got a few minutes left.
Well, there was just a couple of quick comments that I thought about. That when you talk about how that gets incentivized for the consumer, obviously it's a very easy play. But I think the consumer and the advertising play is a somewhat smaller part. From a consumer perspective, it's very large, but the infrastructure, such as roads and planning, pollution, et cetera, offer great resources for the data that can be taken from those trusted data sets and actually applied into some very interesting applications. And I think that data products, rather than the network, are the important piece. To refer back to the streamer piece, I think that focusing on the data product and treating data as the product rather than the byproduct, and using well-governed, well-practiced and industry robust backends allows for that data to be served in a very special way. And for the community growth, for developing the consumer proposition, it's all about trust. And once you start to get into trust in the community, that starts to talk about privacy, ethics, security, value, and of course, governance. And Pool is quite well placed, as I come from a background in data governance, I should stress, that we have a very robust data governance process that ensures and can be communicated well out to the community to engender trust and create that relationship and allow the users to provide that consent for the data to be shared. So it's a very nice match to bring those two disparate worlds, or should we say almost congruent worlds of trust and permission together. And the only way you'll grow your community and grow the use of that data is through engendering that trust to your end users, to your suppliers, to the data buyers, which means well-governed, well-structured, and well-produced data product. So allowing everyone to focus on the product rather than the back end and create those sets is the way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Kelly, for allowing the interjection there.
Oh, of course, thank you.
I was just going to say, maybe I'll just close with the one, by putting the ball back into everyone else's court, in a sense. I hope I've kind of laid out that vision of I think, how to finally unlock mobility data for the mobility industry. And really then the challenge is on everyone else here to say, can the mobility industry do a visa, right? Can they come together, create in a sense, a joint cooperative venture, and therefore get ahead of Silicon Valley, Apple and Google et al. Otherwise, I think, it'll all be lost. I think you're all competitors, but you're actually will be much, much stronger when it comes to creating a data ecosystem out of all of this by cooperating together. And I hope that vision is therefore appealing, but it also requires bravery. So I hope people are brave enough to respond. Let's see. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shiv and John as well, for a great lecture. Really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you everyone for joining. As I said earlier, this lecture was recorded, so it'll be available on our website. And if you're subscribed to our bulletin, you'll get the lecture recording as well. And on that same page, you'll see a lot of upcoming lectures, so be sure to check those out. And thank you again, Shiv, for a great lecture.
Most
Have a good
welcome.
rest of your day, everyone.